Welcome to today's BMAT preparation talk. My name is Majid. I'm a second year medical student studying at Cambridge University. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the BMAT and hopefully giving you some tips and advice on how to tackle the BMAT. So this will be useful for anyone who's sitting the exam either this year in a few weeks, or if you're in year 12 and you're sitting it next year. So just an outline of the presentation. I'll start by telling you about the BMAT, and then I'll tell you which universities are using it at the moment. I'll talk about some key dates to bear in mind with the BMAT, and also I'll then, in the second half of the presentation, I'll discuss the sections in detail, and I'll talk about strategies you can employ for those. After this, I'll go through some worked BMAT questions, and at the end, as Emily said, you'll be able to ask any questions either over chat or asking me directly. So here's a timeline of the medical application process. So most of you will be in year 12 or year 13. There may be some graduates in the call who are applying for graduate medicine, but obviously everyone sits the BMAT if you're applying to a BMAT university. So what is the BMAT? The BMAT stands for the Biomedical Admissions Test. This is a 2-hour exam that's traditionally been sat on paper. However, this year, for the first time, it'll be online. The BMAT is a test of your existing knowledge and skills. So it's more important that you're able to apply things that you already know than it is to learn new things for this exam. It's important to note that this is an exam used to screen applicants. So it's not the be-all end-all of your application process, but it'll be used alongside your personal statement, your interview, and things like GCSE grades as well. So it's just one piece in the puzzle. Another thing that's important to note is that it needs different preparation to the UCAT exam. It's a completely different kettle of fish, and whilst the UCAT is sat just before the BMAT, they are very different exams. Okay, who uses the BMAT? So you can see some of the universities that use it as of this year. And this is important to consider when you're applying for universities, because you want to know the requirements of each uni. And because each different university will use the BMAT in a different way. So bear in mind that what the cutoff for one university might be different for another, and some universities might not even have a cutoff. They may just use it as part of the screening process. There are 2 sittings for the BMAT. You can sit one in September, and there's another one that you can sit in November. So sitting in September has the bonus of you having your results before you apply to universities. However, not all universities accept the September sitting. So I know Oxford for undergrad medicine, they don't accept the September sitting. All universities do accept the November sitting, which I think is what most people choose, but it's entirely up to you which one you choose. And it's usually sat early in November during half term. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the BMAT content now. So it's split into 3 sections. Section 1 is testing your thinking skills, and you're asked 32 multiple choice questions in 60 minutes. Section 2 is testing your scientific knowledge and your application of this knowledge. Likewise, this is multiple choice questions, and you get 27 that you have to do in 30 minutes, so much less time to answer those. Finally, section 3, this is the writing task, and you have to write a little less than the side of A4, and you've got another 30 minutes to answer that. So the exam in total is 2 hours, with 1 hour for section 1, 30 minutes for section 2, and 30 minutes for section 3. I'm going to make a quick point about BMAT resources. I'll refer to these as we go through the PowerPoint, but the most important resources, I think, are these three. So for section 1 and 2, what I found most useful was going on the Cambridge Admissions website. They have all of the BMAT past papers, and a really good idea would be to have a go at all of those past papers to make sure you're fully prepared. Another great resource is BMAT Ninja. So some of you may have heard of this. They have a really big question bank, and they have lots of worked solutions, which are done by Oxford students. And so it really helps with understanding of the questions in section 1 and 2. For section 3, I found the 700 BMAT questions book really useful, as it gave some really great examples of essays and what score they would get. A lot of people find this book useful for section 1 and 2, but of course that's personal preference. So what I would recommend is having a look at all of these resources and finding the ones that work for you. Cambridge Admissions website is obviously free to use. BMAT Ninja, you can access a lot of their questions for free. And as for the BMAT practice questions book, you can find it in your local library or your school library. Okay, so I'm going to talk about section 1 in detail now. So section 1 is the thinking skills section. Like I said, you have 32 multiple choice questions in 1 hour. This gives you about 1:50 per question. Usually timing isn't a big problem for section 1. It's more of a problem for section 2, as I'll get onto. But it's important to still try and stick to timings with all of these questions. So you don't want to be spending 3-4 minutes on one question, because you'll be potentially compromising marks that you could get later on in the paper. Section 1 is making sure that you can do 2 things. So there are 16 questions that test that you can do problem solving. And then there are also 16 questions that test that you can think critically. Now, problem solving questions are testing that you can select relevant information and then determine and apply appropriate calculations to work out what the question's asking. On the other hand, the critical thinking questions, these are quite formulaic. You're always presented with an argument, and then you're asked a question based on that argument. So some general tips for section 1. In terms of problem solving, I think the most important thing I can recommend is to practice questions. Practice as many questions as you can to get familiar with problem solving questions. Because of the general format of problem solving questions, I can't really suggest a single strategy that works 100% of the time. And for that reason, you just need to really go through as many questions as you can. Another good hint that somebody told me was to make notes of areas for improvement. So if there are certain areas where you keep making a similar mistake, then just make a note of that. And so you can target that area and make sure that you don't make as many mistakes in that area. Because every question in the BMAT counts, and so you don't want to have one area of weakness to let you down. So in complete contrast to that, critical thinking questions, like I said, are really formulaic. So you can absolutely prepare for them, and I'm going to talk about some strategies in a few slides' time. So for critical thinking, my best advice, again, practice questions. That's going to be a running theme in this presentation. Practice makes perfect. And then also use the strategy that works for you. If you have a methodical approach for critical thinking questions, then that's really going to help, and it'll really put you in good stead for the rest of the exam. Okay, so here's an example of a typical problem-solving question. So I'm going to give you all 2 minutes now, just to have a look at this question and see if you can have a go. So if you've got some pen and paper handy, that'd be quite useful. But I'll give you 2 minutes and just have a go at this question, and then I'll discuss it afterwards. Okay, so I'll stop you guys there. So that was about 2 minutes. That's maybe just a little under 2 minutes, but hopefully that gives you an idea that 2 minutes is a decent amount of time, and it's enough to answer these questions if you employ the right calculations. So let's go over this question. So my first advice for this would be to ignore all the data that you're given and go straight to the question. So who qualifies for a bonus? And you can see that the options are, it can be nobody, it can be one person, or it can be more than one person who qualifies. So once you know what you're looking for, you need to find out what a bonus is and who can qualify for it. So now I'm going to look at the data, and I see that in order to qualify for a bonus, employees must fulfill certain criteria. So we have data for a £1,000 bonus, and we have data for a £500 bonus. So quickly looking at these, you can tell that for all points, it's easier to get the £500 bonus than the £1,000 bonus. So what this means is if you get the £1,000 bonus, then you must have already qualified for the £500 one. Because of that, we can completely disregard this top box. So this is what it means by choosing relevant information. So this is there just to confuse you. So now that we've picked the relevant part of the question, we need to compare it with the table of data that we're given. So we know that for a £500 bonus, we need absences of less than 10%. We need to meet production targets, and we need rejects of less than 8% of output. So if we look at the table, let's go through these one by one. So absences less than 10%. This is the same as attendance of over 90%. So if you have to have less than 10% absences, by definition, you must have attendance of over 90%. So let's look at the table. So we can see that Smith has 95, Jones 90, Patel 100, Owololu 96, and McKay 97. So in this case, we know that Smith, Patel, Owololu, and McKay all have attendance over 90. The only one who doesn't is Jones. And so we can mark off those who have attendance over 90. Next, we're talking about meeting production targets. So we're actually given here overproduction target. So from this, we can tell that, okay, overproduction target, therefore, in order to meet the production target, I need at least an overproduction target of 0. Because if I've overproduced by 0%, it means I've produced the target amount. And so the first 4 people all have 0 or above, so we can put a tick for those. And then finally, we want rejects of less than 8% of the total output. And therefore, that means we want over 92% of the total output to be accepted. And this is true for everyone. So if we look in this table, we can see that the only people who have ticks for all of these are Smith, Patel, and Owololu. And because of that, we know that it's going to be D. So hopefully that makes sense. Well done if you put D. If not, just go through this question. It'll be in one of the papers, and hopefully that'll make sense. But again, the more of these questions you do, the easier it becomes. So I'm going to give you another question now. So I'll give you another 2 minutes to do this, and hopefully you'll put into practice what I've just told you. So look at what the question's asking you, then look at the data, and then try and find a way around it. Okay. So 2 minutes for this. Okay, so that's 2 minutes up. So I'm going to talk to you about how I would have tackled this question. Bear in mind that there's more than one way of doing this question. However, this I think would be the easiest way. So if we look at the question, so first up, Lenton cars hire out cars at a cost of £50 per day if the number of miles is less than 80, and then there's an extra charge of £1 for every mile travelled over 80 miles. Then Dunford Hire charge £60 per day for taking the car out, and then 50p for every mile travelled. Okay. And when you read this, first of all, it's very easy to just completely passively read it and not absorb anything, which is why it's really important to read the question, the main question first. So knowing that you're trying to work out how many miles would the cost of hiring a car be the same for both companies, that immediately engages your brain into thinking, okay, so there's two companies, I need to find out after how many miles they would cost the same. Okay, so to do this, the best way and the easiest way would just be to form an equation. And so if we consider the number of miles traveled in total, and that could be X, so we look at Lenton cars first. We know that they have a fixed charge of £50 for the day, and that is for under 80 miles. And then there'll be an extra charge of £1 for every mile over 80. So if we have the total of X miles, that means that you're being charged for £1 for X minus 80 miles, because it's the total miles minus the first 80, which are for free. And so that's the equation you get. You get 50 for the fixed charge plus X minus 80. And now let's consider Dunford Hire. So Dunford Hire, they charge £60 per day as a fixed charge, and then 50p for every mile. The important thing for this is to realize that Dunford Hire do not have the first 80 miles for free. And so it's going to be 60 plus 0.5 times the total miles. Once you have this, it's really easy, and I'm 100% sure that you can do this. You just solve for X, and you'll get that X equals 180. So this was a much more of a maths-based question than the last one we did, but you can see that it's not any maths that you won't have come across before. The only difficult thing is identifying what you need to do. Okay. So hopefully that's helped with problem-solving questions. Now I'm going to go over critical thinking questions, which are very preparable for. So with critical thinking questions, you're presented with an argument. So this is a paragraph of text, and in this argument, you're given reasons, and these reasons are put forward as grounds for a conclusion. Because of this, you can say that an argument would be good if its conclusion logically follows the reasons that have been given. And also, if you accept the reasons, then logically, you have to accept the conclusion. Hopefully that all makes sense, but the important thing to realize is that you have a conclusion, and the conclusion is based off various reasons. An important thing to note in critical thinking questions is the conclusion does not have to be at the end of the argument. So I'm sure you're all used to seeing a conclusion as being the final few lines of a piece of writing. But the conclusion could be the very first line, or it could be somewhere in the middle, or it could be at the end. So this is important to bear in mind. When you're looking for a conclusion, make sure you're looking for keywords. So words like therefore, thus, so, it follows that. All of those words are sort of their warning signs telling you that a conclusion is right here, is guiding you to conclusion. Finally, I'm going to talk about what an assumption is. So an assumption is a crucial part of an argument that is not stated in the text. So essentially, it's something that is taken for granted in order to make the conclusion. I'll go over a little bit more about what I mean by that. So there are 7 types of critical thinking questions that you can get. And if you can prepare for all 7 of these, then you'll be completely ready for the exam. So the first question that you could be asked is to identify the main conclusion. This means that somewhere in the argument, the conclusion has been written and you need to work out where this conclusion is. So you need to find out what the argument is trying to get you to accept. So you're looking for words like therefore, thus, it follows that, things like that. The second type of question you could be asked is to draw a conclusion. So in this case, the conclusion won't be in the paragraph, but you have to figure out what the conclusion could be based on the reasons given. So remember the diagram again, you're given some reasons and you need to figure out what would logically follow these reasons. The third type of question would be to identify an assumption. So in this case, you're looking for something that is not stated in the argument, but is taken for granted in the conclusion. These are often quite instinctive questions. So often you can almost get a sense of what the answer is quite passively. But if this isn't the case, then again, you have to make sure you understand what the conclusion is to then be able to identify what the assumption is. The fourth type of question would ask you to assess the impact of additional evidence. So in these questions, you're given 5 statements and you need to figure out that if these statements were true, which of them would weaken the argument most. And again, for this, you need to figure out what the conclusion is to be able to say which statement would weaken it the most. Fifth type of question is detecting reasoning errors. So why does the conclusion not logically follow the reasons given? This is quite similar to 3 in that you're identifying a flaw in the argument. The sixth type is matching arguments. So you're given an argument and you have to apply the logic of that argument to another scenario. And that tests that you understand the structure. So for example, if an argument is saying, because A, B, and because B, C, you have to be able to apply that structure to a different scenario. And then similarly with question 7, this is applying principles. So instead of applying the structure of the argument, you're applying the general kind of underlying axiom. So an example of this would be if you're presented with an argument that says people who smoke should have to pay for healthcare if they get lung cancer because of their smoking. And now the principle there is that people with self-inflicted illnesses should have to pay for their treatment. And so if you were given 5 options, one of these options could be that people who drink excessively should have to pay for their treatment if they get liver cirrhosis because of their drinking. So again, this is applying a principle that is presented to you in a question and then applying it to a different scenario. Okay, so here's an example of a critical thinking question. The important thing for these is to read the main question first before reading the argument. So in this case, the main question is, which of the following is an underlying assumption of the argument above? So the reason it's important to look at the main question first is because it will engage your brain into the right mode. So for example, this is assumption finding mode, or it could be that you need to be in conclusion finding mode or understanding mode. But either way, you need to make sure you know what you're reading instead of just reading because of the sake of it. And so I'm going to give you 2 minutes to answer this question, reading the main question first, and then having a go to see if you can figure out what this would be. Okay, so that's 2 minutes up. So in this question, we were asked which of the following is an underlying assumption of the argument above. So just going back to this, we can see that in identifying the assumption, we're looking for something that is not stated, but is something that we're taking for granted in the conclusion. And so essentially what this is saying is the argument is saying that you get A to B and then C to D, but you never get B to C. So there's something missing that is not developed in the argument. So in this example, we're identifying the assumption. So immediately we're going through and we're trying to find the conclusion. And then we're also trying to locate anywhere where there's an inconsistency. So one of the ways to do this is to read the text, and if something stands out, then that's great. But if not, you can go through the 5 options and you can test each one of them. So let's do that. So option A states that the records of the Secret Service are readily available to its former employees. So this is not assumed anywhere because it says that the documents are given to not given to outsiders in the final part of the text, but it doesn't mention anything about former employees, so you can't take that as an assumption. Point B, the work of the Secret Service is undervalued as a result of publication of distorted accounts of its working. This is also not assumed because it goes beyond what this text is telling us. So it's almost irrelevant information that is trying to trick you into selecting that. C is also not assumed for the same reason, because it's not mentioned. So the seedy side of the Secret Service is of minor significance compared with the important work it carries out. So that's not mentioned anywhere in the text, so that's not an assumption that the argument is making. Point D, legal restrictions against revealing the inner workings of the Secret Service do not apply to those who have been dismissed. This is not assumed. This is not assumed because it's wrong, because it says that all who have been employed in the Secret Service face legal restrictions, and so D is obviously an incorrect statement. So that leaves us with E by process of elimination, but let's see why E is correct. So E says that those who have a grievance against the Secret Service are either unable or unwilling to give a balanced account of its workings. So this is correct, because as we can see from the start, it says that people who write books usually have a sense of grievance against the Secret Service. And then it later says that because of this, only the seedy side of the Secret Service is exposed. So again, if we think back to that, we have an A to B and a C to D, but nowhere does it give us the reason for why the seedy side is always exposed. So it doesn't say that people who have a grievance will always give a biased account of it. So that is the assumption that this argument makes. So hopefully you will put E for that. If not, hopefully you now understand why. So I'm going to go through another example. This will be the final example we do. So another 2 minutes. Remember, look at the main question first, think about what you're looking for, then look at the text. So another 2 minutes, starting now. Okay, so that's 2 minutes up. Hopefully you've got an idea of what the answer is. So first things first, we look at the question. So which of the following, if true, would most weaken the above argument? Okay, so we know that we're looking to find the conclusion. That's what we're trying to do. And so I won't go through the whole text, but the text in essence is saying that the high use of natural resources in industrialized countries and the consequence of higher standard of living in these countries compared with developing countries. And that's what the argument is discussing. So the conclusion can be drawn that if the standard of living, if the standard of living of the developing countries is to increase to that of industrial countries, then even with no increase in the developing country population, there would need to be much greater consumption of resources. So in order for developing countries to increase the standard of living, we need an increased consumption of resources, and that is with zero population change. Okay, so let's look at the options one by one. So A says that the population of developing countries is likely to increase substantially over the next decade. So this would not weaken the argument. In fact, this strengthens the argument, because if the population of developing countries increases, we can infer from this that we're going to need more resources. So point B, many of the resources needed for industrial production are increasingly expensive to produce. So this might be true, but it doesn't really weaken the above argument. And the reason it doesn't weaken the argument is because it's not particularly relevant, because we're discussing consumption of resources and not cost. So point C, new technological developments in industrial processes are likely to reduce the need for high consumption of resources. So this is correct, because if new technologies are produced, which would reduce consumption of materials, then living standards would be able to increase in developing countries without such a high consumption of resources. So this is the correct answer, because this would weaken the argument. So point D, this is also not the correct answer, and we can confirm that as well as point E. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So the correct answer was C, because this point would most weaken the argument that is being made. Okay. So we've now covered section 1 in quite a lot of detail. I'm going to briefly go over section 2 and just talk a little bit about what it consists of. So you get a minute per question in section 2, and it's much more time pressured than section 1. And so if you're doing this paper, it's important to just guess and skip after 1 minute and not spend too much time on a particular question. So section 2 is testing your application of biology, chemistry, physics, and maths, all to a GCSE level. So it's important that you know all of these to a good level, but remember, only GCSE level needs to be known. And something to note is that it covers all syllabuses, so you may need to do extra reading. And the best way to do this extra reading would be to go through the BMAT Section 2 guide and specification. This is available on the Cambridge Admissions website. And the best thing to do for this is to go on the website, download the guide, and make sure you have all of the knowledge, especially in physics, if you're not doing A-level physics, because you'll have likely forgotten that from GCSE. So make sure you go through the specification, and as long as you know all of the specification, you'll be completely fine for the exam in terms of knowledge. I'd also recommend memorizing any formulae, because these will often come up. So there are certain key formula that you just need to know. Like with section 1, it's really useful to just practice loads of questions. So you can start by going through at a normal pace and then looking at the work solutions. And then once you're more confident, go through them under timed conditions. And again, importantly, you need to see where you went wrong in questions. So if you're making a mistake in a particular area of physics quite often, then make a note of that so you can answer more physics questions. And this makes sure that you won't have one area of weakness that could let you down. And then another point is to maybe have these units handy. So these sorts of things often come up in questions, and it makes converting units much easier if you know that milli is 10 to the minus 3 and micro is 10 to the minus 6. Those are the two that most often come up. So here's an example of a section 2 question. I'm just going to go through this quite quickly. It's just a GCSE physics question. I think beforehand, I'll give you all a minute to answer this question. So if you have a minute starting from now, and then I'll go through it with you. Okay, so that's the minute up. Hopefully you have an answer. If not, I'll go through it now. So in this question, we're asked two things. So again, I'm looking straight at the question first of all. So if we consider this as a wave, what is the amplitude and frequency of this wave? So we're trying to figure out the amplitude and we're trying to figure out the frequency. So these are both key components of GCSE physics. So if you're in year 12 or 13 and you haven't done GCSE physics in a while, then this is potentially something that you could trip up on. So that's why it's really important to have a look at the specification. So for this question, the way we can calculate this is amplitude is the distance from the height from the peak to the trough divided by 2. So the height at the peak is 16, the height at the trough is 10. So the height from peak to trough would be 16 minus 10, or 6, and divide by 2 to get the amplitude. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And so immediately we can narrow down the options to either A or B. Now we want to work out the frequency. So frequency is calculated by 1 divided by period, and period is the time for one wave in seconds. So in order to do frequency, we need 1 divided by the period, and to calculate the period, we need the time for one wave. So if we go from this peak to this peak, so we have 18 hours and 6 hours, so the time is 18 minus 6, 12 hours, but remember we need it in seconds. So 12 times 3,600 to get it into seconds. And so from that, we can tell that the answer is going to be A. So hopefully that makes sense. These sorts of questions are actually not too difficult to do, but in order to do them quickly, you need to have the underlying knowledge. So that's why it's important to revise and make sure you have a complete and full understanding of biology, chemistry, maths, and physics at GCSE level. Okay, so let's talk about section 3 now. This is one that a lot of students find quite difficult, and it's one that I myself was quite worried about when I was in year 12 and 13. But hopefully I'm going to show you that it's not actually too difficult. All you have to do is perform one writing task from a choice of 3 that are given. Each writing task will have a number of sub-questions, and the function of the task is to test your ability to select, develop, and organize ideas, and to be able to communicate these ideas in a concise and effective way. So what this is saying is that the key is not so much the end content but it's the process you take to reach this end content. So in order to have a decent writing task, you need to have a well-planned essay and you need to answer all the sub-questions. So I'll be addressing those 2 points in the next slide. But again, what I do want to just say again is it's important not to be overwhelmed by section 3, because it's not an essay as such. It's just writing 3 or 4 paragraphs. Remember that you're only given 30 minutes to write this, so they're not expecting a really incredibly well-crafted essay. It's just about being concise and effective with information. So my tips for section 3: start by looking at model answers to get an idea of what section 3 questions look like. So you can find these online, or you can find these in the 700 BMAT questions book. And this should just give you an idea about how you can structure an essay and for how to organize an essay. I'd also recommend, once you're comfortable with the idea of writing them, is to practice in timed conditions. I think doing about 5 or 6 is a good number to aim for. By all means, do more. However, doing 5 or 6 should be enough to prepare you adequately for the exam. One resource that I found really useful, especially for section 3, was Ali Abdal's BMAT Tips YouTube page. And that is, it's quite a useful channel. It's got a lot of tips for all 3 sections. And so one of the pieces of advice he gives is to choose and plan well for 15 minutes and then spend the second 15 minutes writing the essay. So this means you're spending half of your time planning and half your time writing. But this will work out well because it allows you to choose the question that you can answer the best and to plan it well. And then all the writing part is just getting what you've planned down onto paper. So this is what I did in my exam, and it worked quite well. So that was quite a useful tip. Something else to note is that it's important to do the question that you think you can answer the best, as opposed to the question that you think is the most interesting or the one that has the quote in it. So just do the question that you think you have the most to say for. And most importantly for section 3, like I said in the last slide, you need to answer all the sub-questions to make sure that you get the score of 3, and you have to make sure that you have good spelling, punctuation, and grammar. If you do this, you'll get a 3A, which is above the cutoff for all medical schools. So this is the top advice for section 3. So once you get your results, the way these are given is your raw score will be converted to a mark from 1 to 9, and a good score can be considered as about 5 in section 1 and 5 in section 2. Anything above that is you're doing really well. And in section 3, you're marked by 2 examiners on a scale of 1 to 5 for content and A to E for your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And then you're given the average. So if one examiner gives you 3A and the other gives you 4C, then you'll be given 3.5B. Okay, I'm going to quickly summarize now. So I've shown you a lot of information and a lot of strategies, but hopefully you've realized that the BMAT is an exam that you can very easily prepare for, and you can prepare for very effectively. But that is the most important thing that you can do, is prepare for it. So I would aim to start working about a month before the exam itself and try to do about 1 or 2 hours per day. I think that's quite a good thing to aim for. Bear in mind timing restrictions for section 2, which is the science section, and section 3, which is the writing task section. Practice as many questions as you can for section 1 and 2, and look at worked answers, and employ specific strategies, including the ones that I've shown you today. It's important to practice section 3 in timed conditions as well, and that will make sure that you're used to doing it for when you're in the exam. Finally, make the most of online resources, especially Cambridge Admissions website. It has all the past papers, it has a lot of information, and also places like BMAT Ninja. And you can answer you can get access to pretty much all of these resources for free. So it's a really good thing you can do, and it's best to make the most of it. Okay, so all that leaves me to say is good luck with your applications, and to wish you the best of luck going forward. There's now some time to answer any questions if you've got any, so I'm going to stop sharing.
So there's a number of questions on the chat. So there's one saying, does the BMAT paper happen all at once, or do you only get one section at a time? So essentially, are the two sections timed together or separately?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the way it works is you are given each section separately, but they're given one after another. So you'll write your answers for section 1, and then the answer sheet is taken away, the question paper is taken away, and then you're given section 2 straight after. So there's no real break in between. It's given straight afterwards.
There's another one asking what the difference is between the BMAT and the UCAT exams. I mean, that's a whole topic by itself, but if you could just briefly explain the difference.
So I guess the main difference is BMAT has a science component to it. Section 1 for BMAT is actually not too different to UCAT. So in terms of your problem solving and critical thinking, it's quite similar to problem solving and qualitative reasoning in UCAT. And also you have the essay section in BMAT as well. So the reason I say that it's very different preparation is because section 2, you need to focus on science, and section 3, you have to be prepared to write an essay. So those are the two components that are most different.
There's another question saying, how did you find the BMAT test when you did it?
So when I did it, I was very nervous at the time, but running up to the exam, I found out about a lot of these different strategies that you can use, and realizing that it's actually an exam that you can prepare for quite easily by using these strategies, especially for critical thinking. And yeah, just realizing that as long as you prepare and you put the work in, then you'll do fine. And I ended up doing okay from that. So that's my biggest advice for that.